speaking.
This is Slate 1 of Roll 2 with Mr. Kim. Did the Americans have any sense of survival in the jungle?
Well, they weren't trained as jungle fighters, generally speaking. Their special forces were. But the ordinary American troops had a minimum of jungle survival training, so that they're all at sea, fighting against a force who are acknowledged as the best jungle fighters, the best guerrilla fighters of all time.
Can you give me an example of Americans?
Well, Americans were burdened down with about 70 pounds of equipment, plus very, very heavy flak jackets, that's armored protected vests. And for instance, on one occasion, I well remember being with an American force. We were going through quite heavy jungle, that is, we're going in line, because only one at a time could go. I didn't actually see this happen because I was forward of the victim. But I suddenly heard an American yelling out in great fear, as he was. He was in great danger. In fact, he was dead, because his hand grenades he'd attached to his pack, his military pack on the back, some of them at least. The South Vietnamese and the Viet Cong used to wear them here, where they could take them quickly and where they could get to them if anything happened. He had them there, and a twig went through the pin of the grenade, and he went on, it pulled the pin out. He had no hope to get to it. He was clawing around trying to get to it, and of course it blew up and killed him.
There must have been some effective, good American units though.
Yes, there were some good American units, and the American soldier could have been just as good as any other soldier if he'd had the opportunity and the training. So it wasn't his fault, it was the fault of the whole system. But there were good units like the Special Forces. Even they were not allowed to do the job they were trained for, that is long-range patrols and long-range reconnaissance. They were subject to the order that they were to be kept in the highlands training highland troops, that is, ethnic mountain tribesmen.
So they never got out to do any fighting?
So the Special Forces didn't fight in the way they were trained to fight. So they were less effective, much less effective than they could have been. At the same time, they were probably the most effective American fighting force.
Can you say that they were the most effective, but at the same time they were forced to train rather than do what they were trained to do, fight?
Well, when I say trained, it was on-the-job training. The Americans established camps, Special Forces camps in the highlands, which were very sparsely populated. And it was infiltration route for the North Vietnamese forces coming through from North Vietnam. Their job was to intercept those communist forces coming through. They did do that to a certain extent, but they did it from base camps, and therefore they were very easily detected and could be neutralized, if not defeated, by the communist forces, who would run around them in the jungle, laying down fire on their bases, ambushing them as they came out. If they'd have been allowed to fight as small, efficient fighting forces for which they were trained, that type of fighting they were trained, they could have done a much more effective job.
Typically, how did the Americans carry out an operation?
Well, an American military unit, that is Marines, paratroopers or infantry, only went into an offensive operation, that is into communist-held territory, if they had what they called certain assets. That is, before they went in, they had airstrikes on the landing zone and the landing area, and artillery strikes. If they didn't have those things, they didn't go in. So they would go in. The Viet Cong having, of course, gone down there into their tunnels like rabbits and were not affected at all by this artillery and air strikes against them. The Americans would then land grouped in large numbers. Quite often the Viet Cong would hit them then, the Viet Cong or North Vietnamese, would hit them at that time. They were very vulnerable at that time, and one shell in a group of 50 or 100 Americans could do a lot of damage, whereas an American shell landing allegedly among Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops would do Little damage, because there are 3 here and 7 there, and 40 or 50 spread over an area of a square mile, but they were everywhere. So you would have to saturate the whole region to be effective. Of course, the Americans tried that too, and therefore destroyed everything.
Can you tell me specifically how the South Vietnamese army was more effective than the Americans then?
The South Vietnamese army was more effective than the American forces simply because they didn't rely on all those assets, that is, air support, artillery, always within range of their forces, and medical evacuation, reinforcements always ready to move to the rescue of a besieged unit. The South Vietnamese army, generally speaking, couldn't rely on any of those assets at all. So, by virtue of the fact, they had to make do with what they had, just the same as the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese had to make do with what they had. They were more effective because of that. If they'd had even less and were forced to fight without any of those assets at all, they probably would have won the war.
Why?
Well, because they would have met the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces exactly on their own ground, and although many people suggested they weren't as good as the North Vietnamese or Viet Cong, I feel very strongly that they were, and they proved it at certain stages of the war. They were just as good as the North Vietnamese troops, sometimes better.
When would the Viet Cong normally attack the Americans?
When the Americans were in an offensive position, that is, when they were attacking on an operation into communist-held territory, the communist forces would generally wait until very late in the afternoon, and probably on the, say, the 3rd day of the operation. Americans were big and cumbersome. They were carrying 70 pounds of equipment. They would get very, very tired, especially when there was mud, paddy fields sort of going, or up in the mountains. It didn't matter where. They would get very tired. They weren't used to that sort of terrain. So that after 2 or 3 days, late on, say, the 3rd day, they would be attacked by relatively fresh communist troops, not burdened by any of the paraphernalia that the Americans had, and they would hit them very late in the day, near sundown.
As opposed to the South Vietnamese, what would they do? How would they get over that?
The South Vietnamese would go on an offensive operation. They knew that they were going to walk somewhere between, let's say, 8 and 15 miles during the day. The Americans used to cover about 4 miles during a day, normally speaking, in the same sort of terrain. Where the Vietnamese would cover 10 miles, the Americans would cover 4. But the South Vietnamese would make camp just before sundown, but then within minutes of the sun going down, they would be off and moving again, because that was only a fake camp. They would march or go forward for another hour and make a camp well after dark. Much harder to detect then.
You let this come through, or is something?
It's okay.
Can you tell me how the Americans secured their fire bases at night, and how the Viet Cong overcame this? I want you to mention the wire, the Claymore mines, and how they changed the tape.
Well, when the Americans set up a defensive perimeter at night, it was as if they were operating in their base camp. You had an eating area and a sleeping area, and you had a defensive perimeter with mines set around. The South Vietnamese did not. The South Vietnamese would go out and set a defensive perimeter, which was in itself an offensive perimeter. They would go out and on ambush patrols and wait for the communists to try and infiltrate. The Americans would set mines. Their favorite mine was a Claymore line, which was about as big as your 2 hands put together, and would be detonated on command, and spray out small pieces of shrapnel, thousands of pieces, towards an oncoming enemy. but only went in one direction. It stood up on a stick and faced in the direction towards the enemy. The VC would crawl in and turn the mines around very carefully under cover of darkness, turn the mines around 180 degrees so they faced the American. They would then mount a bogus attack, lots of noise and yelling. Americans, of course, would detonate the mines straight back upon themselves. That was just one facet.
What about the phosphorus tape? Americans were
Reloading? Good. Turn it off there.